Welcome to You Decide. I'm your host, Errol Lewis. My very first journalism job out of college was as a reporter for the now defunct City Sun newspaper. We were operating out of Brooklyn. One of the first stories I covered, it happened the year that the newspaper started, was the 1984 killing of Eleanor Bumpurs. She was an elderly grandmother who was being evicted from the Sedgwick houses in the Bronx for having missed about 4 rent payments of less than $100 a month each. She was in poor mental health. They sent officers from the NYPD's emergency services unit. These are officers supposedly trained to handle emotionally disturbed persons' cases. They were sent in to assist in the eviction. When they went in, they carried plastic shields, a metal Y-bar, meant to restrain this person, this grandmother. She panicked. She began waving a knife. The encounter escalated, and Officer Stephen Sullivan fired 2 shotgun blasts. The first one blew her hand off, and the second one killed Eleanor Bumpurs. My guest today is LaShawn Harris. She's a historian who was 10 years old at the time, living right near where all of this took place. She had been looking forward to Halloween in her Bronx neighborhood until the neighborhood was turned upside down by this killing and the subsequent turmoil, the political demonstrations. It was a really important, pivotal time in the city, and she has captured it in a way that really nobody else has. A lot of us lived through it or wrote about it in bits and pieces, but she summarized it. It's called Tell Her Story, Eleanor Bumpurs and the Police Killing That Galvanized New York City, and she is my guest today. Great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
You are a professor at Wayne State University. Are you based out there? Are you here in the city? What are you doing these days?
I am a professor at Michigan State.
Oh, excuse me.
Michigan State University,
yes.
And I am based in East Lansing, but I'm from here. My parents still live here. My sister lives here between here and Baltimore. So I'm a New Yorker. Okay. I still consider even though I can't vote here, but I'm still a New Yorker. I'm from the Bronx. Yeah.
You describe it in the book, but how did this become a topic for scholarly treatment? You do deal with working class communities and some of the dynamics within them, but it sounds like this case kind of haunted you in a personal way.
You know, I had just finished wrapping up my first book, which was on 1920s and 30s underground economy workers, and I wanted to stay in New York. I know I wanted to also go probably in the 70s and the 80s, but I wasn't really sure on what I wanted to do. But really, after talking with my mom and some family friends about just the Bronx and the community and this particular case, I said, well, maybe I'll do something on Eleanor Bumpurs. And it started out really as a short article piece. And then I decided I would do a full treatment, mainly because I feel like Eleanor Bumpurs, really what we know about her is just the murder. The picture that's on the cover of the book, most people have seen. I wanted to really understand the context of who she was. I lived across the street from her. My community was really polarized and galvanized by that killing. So part of it is about her, but also about how that community responded to that killing. Because even if you think about the activism during that particular time, the Bronx piece is really left out of that, of that story. So I was really interested in the neighborhood as well as who she was before we meet her on October 29th, 1984.
The photo that many people have seen that you have on the cover of the book, I did not realize she was in a Red Cross shelter because she'd been burned out of her prior apartment. And you go and excavate all of that, including the horrible conditions in the building that she'd been burned out of. Say a little bit about that. It was a privately owned building.
You know what? It was just by happenstance. I was just looking for more things on Eleanor Bumpurs. I mean, she's a working class, poor woman, no records. And I was doing this, looking at the New York Daily News, and I just happened to come upon a photo of her and her daughter and her grandkids in this shelter. And I was like, well, what is this about? And then I read the story, and she had been a victim, like many Black families during the 1970s, of a burnout. So the photo was taken at this Red Cross shelter, where, the photographer was probably just snapping pictures of just, a whole bunch of people who have been in the shelter. But it made me think about the different ways in which Black women were experiencing, 1970s, 1980s, economic austerity, as well as just, inadequate housing conditions. So,
but see, calling it inadequate doesn't even begin to capture the savagery of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is this building on, what is it, Featherstone Place?
Yeah.
And somebody had died in the building.
Someone had died in the building.
Frozen to death, encased in ice. That's how bad it was.
The building, most of the residents by the early 1981 had left the building after the fire. But there were a few people who could not leave the building for a whole host of reasons. And there was this one woman who had apparently fell down, hit her head, and froze to death.
It was colder in the apartment than outside. She's encased in ice. They had to thaw her just to do the autopsy. Yeah. I mean, the savagery of the conditions that people were living under, where there are leaks and there's floods and there's ice and there's all of these unlivable conditions. And that's not usually the story that we hear about what was going on in the city at the time. I mean, and as one of the journalists who was running around trying to sort of capture what was going on, it was hard then and even hard now in hindsight to sort of convey just how rough it was for so many people.
Yeah, the newspapers do an excellent job at this. And, Black women and Black families are testifying about, like, the experiences that they are having in those spaces. And the Black press is definitely, the City Sun is one of those newspapers. The New York Amsterdam News is one of those papers where people are testifying about the horrible conditions. I mean, this is Reaganomics, right? So many things have been cut. The city's coming out of this level of economic austerity. And if you were poor during the 70s, this is only exacerbated by Reaganomics. So housing is just horrible for working class Black families.
In her delusional state, Eleanor Bumpurs says, among other things, that Ronald Reagan has sort of come in and is tampering with her apartment. And you make the very, very interesting point that, well, that might not specifically have happened. She wasn't entirely wrong, that he built a career around demonizing lower income Black women in particular and calling them welfare queens and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, Black women and welfare were public enemy number one for an administration that focused on individualism, deregulation, capitalism. I mean, if you were poor, then you were the problem, right? It was a sense of you have no personal responsibility for your own economic affairs. And I love that by Eleanor Bumpurs, not that she was, politically engaged like we may think, but she was in the sense of being able to kind of experience Reaganomics, see Reaganomics on television as it unfolds, and probably reading newspapers like the New York Daily News.
You also go back to where she came from in North Carolina and sort of tell that part of her story. And I guess in some ways it was sort of a reminder. We lose a lot of our historical perspective, but that a lot of people died of a disease, pellagra, that I don't think I'd ever heard of it. I didn't, frankly, hadn't experienced it in our family, at least not under that name. But this was a common sort of set of basically nutritional deficiencies that led to spectacularly high mortality rates in the community she was raised in.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the early 20th century, working class Black and white families are experiencing, virtually like food deserts, right? And many of them happen to succumb to diseases like that. But again, it speaks to the kind of unlivable conditions that, working class people are going through, not even just during the 1980s, but during this particular time. Yeah. And that particular death of her mother in 1920 had a really profound impact on her life as a mother, right? Losing her mother at such a young age, at the age of 9, I think made her her kids a little bit tighter, right? Because she had lost so much before she even had like her first couple of kids.
Right. It's kind of hard to predict, or I've found over the years it's impossible to predict which of these kind of cases, because there are many cases where people have experienced really hard, unfair, brutal mistreatment, and it points to fundamental systemic problems about how we care for the needy, how we deal with people with savage police violence rather than the care that they're entitled to and the law seems to anticipate they're going to get. This one, though, really sort of became a cultural phenomenon almost immediately.
Yeah.
What's your sense of why that happened?
I think that they could relate to Eleanor Bumpurs just as a mother, as a mother, as a grandmother. Benjamin Ward, who was the first Black police commissioner for the NYPD, said that it would have been hard for him to go in and shoot Eleanor Bumpurs because she looked like his mother. Wilbur Tatum, who was the editor of the New York Amsterdam News, said, Eleanor Bumpurs was somebody's mother. Now she's everyone's mother. I mean, it kind of reminded me of the same sentiments when Trayvon Martin was killed. Like, Trayvon Martin became everybody's son. So everyone could kind of relate to this, disabled grandmother, who had a knife for real, but they could relate to that. They imagine their own mothers, their own aunties, being gunned down by the police, and most Black families could relate to the idea of being late on rent. And the prospect of potentially not just being thrown out, but having the police come now, right? So she sort of becomes this poster child for all of these other problems happening in the city, whether it's, municipal neglect, disinvestment, police violence, state violence. Like, she becomes this sort of symbol for a lot of different groups of people. And I think that's why people are able to kind of get behind this particular type of campaign. In the book, I also articulate, like, this for New York probably is the first Say Her Name campaign.
Yes.
For the 1980s.
Yes.
There are a few other women that are killed in New York during the 80s. There are two other. One is Sharon Walker, who was killed in December of 1984. Very little publicity. There's another woman in the late 1980s by the name of Yvonne Smallwood, who's also harmed, beat by the police, and then later dies, right? And those cases don't get as much publicity as Eleanor Bumpurs, as this particular case. So I think it's because of the circumstances as well as the activists that were behind this. So you have like high-profile activists who are coming to this legal justice community.
Sure. And one thing, and I do remember when this came out, Eleanor Bumpurs' 12-gauge eviction, this documentary that a bunch of amateur filmmakers just went and, I mean, incredible amounts of creativity to sort of portray this horror.
You know what? I never saw the doc. I saw like a clip, a tiny clip. I contacted the filmmakers and they were like, we don't have this anymore. We don't know where it is. But the great thing about that documentary is that the documentary, which is about an hour, was done by kids who lived in the building, kids who lived in the neighborhood. And I think this is really the first time, before like Jimmy Breslin and all of the reporters kind of swarmed the neighborhood, this is where we see like young kids going to community members and really asking community members what they thought about this case.
Right.
They taped, a contentious tenants meeting. They went to the courthouse. They went to Eleanor, her door. They taped, where the locks have been taken off. I mean, really inventive stuff for young people. But the first report, one of the first groups of reporters on the scene, like these were children. So we think about, I guess, this kind of legal justice campaign for Bumpurs. Children and teenagers are part of that. Part of that campaign. It's just not, prominent, older adults like, Herbert Daughtry or, David Dinkins, but really children and teenagers become a part of that movement.
It dovetails with what you talk about, the community trauma that follows these kind of killings. It's a headline, it's a protest, maybe there's a follow-up story, the rest of the city moves on.
Right. But
the people who have had to process this, including a 10-year-old future scholar. They live with it forever.
I mean, I think about the people, and some of the people that I talked to who heard the shots, who saw the smoke, who lived on that floor, on the fourth floor, who had to, walk go to the elevator and see the blood. People who, when the police brought her out and put her in the EMS truck, who had to see her, half naked and that wound, right? Those types of things. And some people told me, and I also read this in newspapers, that they were afraid to leave their apartments.
Sure. Sure,
because of just the level of trauma, that they sensed in the air. And at the same time, police were still swarming the area for at least the first couple of weeks and months. You also had District Attorney Marola, his people also doing investigations around the case too. So people were really afraid.
Yeah, and needless to say, the officer was not found criminally liable by the end of the process.
No, it's about a 3-year legal battle to get him to court, and that happens in 1987. And he is tried by a judge. He elects for a bench trial, and he's acquitted. And he just recently passed away, I believe.
Oh, is that right?
In July of 2020.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Here's something I wrote in 2018.
And I have something to say about that too. You were in the book. I had a line in the book. I think it was something like recent Harvard graduate. Right. And, in the editing process, I had to cut. But you were originally in the book, but you're in the notes. You are in. Oh, okay. You are in my notes.
Okay. Very good.
You're in the footnotes.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Yes. I mean, I like I said, I lived through it. Here's what I wrote in 2018. This is when I had a column in the Daily News. In 2007, so I'm writing in 2018 about something that had happened a decade prior, I interviewed the anguished mother of a teenager named Kyle Coppin, who had called Interfaith Medical Center for help because her son was off his meds and acting odd. When the medical team arrived, Kyle wasn't around, and when he did return and began raging and ranting, his mother called the cops. "Come get me, I have a gun, let's do this," Kyle shouted at the cops. He was holding a hairbrush. Cops fired 10 bullets into the teenager, killing him. This year, like every year, we can point to half a dozen similar cases. That is why people are protesting. James Owens, a 63-year-old man who had wrestled with mental illness his whole life, was tasered, then shot to death by cops in January. He was holding a knife and a spoon. In July, a 32-year-old man named Dwayne Jern fell into the same fatal pattern at his Flatbush Gardens home. Family members called to report erratic behavior, after which cops arrived, shooting first with a taser and then bullets, killing Jern. Last fall saw a trio of tragedies. In the Bronx, a neighbor called cops and claimed a man named Ariel Galarzo was agitated and holding a knife. He died after being tasered by cops. It turned out the knife was actually a bottle of hot sauce. That same month, 66-year-old Deborah Danner, who suffered from schizophrenia, was shot to death in her apartment by Sergeant Hugh Barry. He was indicted and charged with murder, subsequently acquitted. In November, Erickson Gomez Brito, who had struggled with addiction and depression, shot to death in the Van Dyke houses after scuffling with cops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to this very day. And we're going into an election where some of these topics are still being talked about, and you realize that the city's infrastructure is not that much different than it was in 1984.
No, not at all. When you were reading off those names, I also thought about maybe a couple of years ago Wynn Rosario and Ozone
Kowalski Treywick.
Yeah. Who called the police on himself, I believe.
And they came and killed him.
Tased first, I think, and then eventually shot. And these are things that continuously happen, even amid police reform, such as the CIT or the Be Heard programs. People are still dying at the hands of police. And I know that officers and city leaders will say, well, we get X amount of calls per year.
500 calls a day about emotionally disturbed persons.
And it hardly ever amounts to anyone dying. So if someone like Eleanor Bumpurs or Wynn Rosario dies, then that's rare. But even one is too much.
Look, it happens about, as far as I can tell, about half a dozen times a year. That we know of, that makes the newspapers. Right. So, you could probably add 20 or 30% more, but half a dozen times a year is, every other month, the cops are going and killing somebody who's emotionally disturbed. Yeah. The distressing part, or one of the distressing parts for me, is we're coming into an election season and trying to have a discussion about this. The politicians are talking past each other, I guess would be the nicest way to put it. At least one or two of the candidates have said, hey, maybe we shouldn't be sending people with tasers and guns and handcuffs and clubs to deal with somebody who's sick, who's emotionally ill. Maybe we should send somebody who's medically trained. Sure. And the reaction in a lot of cases, including from some of the editorial boards, from some of my fellow journalists, frankly, is that that's a nutty idea.
Sure.
Some of these people might be violent. Let's send in the guys with the guns who have no training and who go in and kill people every other month.
It's a tragedy. And even with training, I'm specifically thinking about like the Be Heard program or the CIT program, where you have officers who may be trained. I think by the end of 2016, at over 4,000 officers have been trained.
Yes.
But those are the officers that are not getting those calls too, right?
Right.
Right. And if you think about the Be Heard program, that program is not in all of the police precincts throughout the city. It definitely wasn't a program in the where Wynn Rosario was.
No.
Right?
They had it during like business hours. It was like 9 to 5, 5 days a week.
Yeah. So I wonder about you have these programs, but I wonder about like real investment in those programs, resources.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not here to argue for reform or abolition, right?
I'll do that.
Right. But at the same time, reform based upon what we're seeing is not working.
Yeah. What we have is a situation that should have been corrected decades ago. The case that you're writing about in this book. And decades later, it doesn't seem to have moved very far. The Be Heard program, some of these other ones, there are examples outside of New York where they have almost perfected it. Yeah. This one in Eugene, Oregon, where they have the first intervention is therapeutic and medical.
Wow.
They call the cops if they think they need them, and then very importantly, they have peer counselors who are part of the process. Mm-hmm. So somebody who's already been down this path of off their meds, in trouble, can sort of connect. We have Fountain House, which has sort of a similar approach. Like I said, very, very hard to make any progress because, and I'll blame my tribe for this, the journalist tribe, it's just so easy to say, here's the hero cop who goes in to save the day, and here's some wild, crazy person in the lower income precincts of the city acting out once again.
And especially if the narratives are about persons with mental health harming other people, pushing them onto subway tracks. Like how can you as a citizen, as a taxpaying person, get behind programs that are there to help folks and be compassionate when you have those types of narratives too, right?
Right. No, that's right. So bring us up to date. You have told a really important chapter of history here, but it's not just intended to be something that sits up on the shelf about, what was happening in 1984. Where does this go next? Where does this conversation go?
I want people who, and again, I understand that once you write a book and it's out there, people will take what they will from the book. But my hope in writing about Eleanor Bumpurs was to really humanize her, like beyond the photo that you see. I also wanted folks to think about families and how families are impacted, right? I interviewed Mary Bumpurs many times.
The daughter.
The daughter who would go on to become the activist. And every time I interviewed her and left her, she was still in 1984, right? And I thought about the kind of slow violence that happens to families, days, months, years, and decades after we have moved on, right?
Sure.
So I think it's important to think about how families are still constantly being impacted. And this is why I love the work of someone like a Kimberly Crenshaw, right, who works with families. And I also wanted people to think about how we treat one another, particularly those who have mental health conditions, and what we are willing to invest in, and what we are willing to hold our politicians accountable to.
There's a phenomenon here that I've just noticed over the years, which is that people who are sort of neglected by the system. They can't get help with income, they can't get help with housing, they can't get help with a lot of different things. Once it reaches a crisis point, though, and certainly after they've been killed, all the tension in the world. Yeah. Now here come the prosecutors, the investigators, the cops, the journalists, all society brings all of these resources.
For a very short time.
Well, very true.
Right?
True.
Until something else.
But even a fraction of that attention would have enabled her to have stable housing, mental health services, and the other support she would have needed to lead a dignified life.
But I would say that it's newspapers like the City Sun and those black newspapers and those left newspapers, the socialist and communist socialist and communist papers of the 80s, who have been constantly talking about these particular issues, right? So I wonder, like, how do people react to those particular types of stories, right? Those stories seem to fall by the waistline. If we took those stories seriously, we probably wouldn't have had, an Eleanor Bumpurs or a Michael Stewart. Or
Sure. Godone Bush and Deborah Danner and on and on and on and on. Kowalski Trawick, et cetera, et cetera. Well, listen, this is quite a contribution. Congratulations. Thanks so much. Don't be a stranger. Tell us about your next book before it comes out.
Okay.
I will urge everybody, take a look at this. If you weren't here at the time, or if you wonder why people keep talking about Eleanor Bumpurs, you see her name flash in a lot of different places in Spike Lee movies and so forth.
And more recently, Tamika Mallory had a protest during the pandemic, actually, that was paired with Eleanor Bumpurs' killing as well as the murder of Breonna Taylor.
Yes. Well, she's as an activist who used to work closely with Al Sharpton. She has a real serious, I think, connection to history, because people like Sharpton have been saying this stuff, protesting along these lines for years and years and years. Thank you so much, LaShawn Harris. Thanks for coming
having me.
Do you want more conversations with the people who are shaping the future of New York City and beyond? Check out our New York One podcast channel in the description. And hit subscribe to let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, elections, and issues.